In part two of this third lecture on the Constitution, in this part talking about the California Constitution, we talked about the procedural elements of the California Constitution, how you can amend the Constitution, and what sort of outcomes come from that. We want to talk a little bit more specifically about the substantive aspects of it, the outcomes that come from our system of government, particularly with an emphasis on the existence of direct democracy. In California Constitution, there are multiple forms of direct democracy in California. Those forms, again, are initiatives, referendums, and recall. All three of those are available in California, but the United States has none of those, has no form of direct democracy, and in many ways, as we saw previously, leads many ways in which there are limits on the input of we the people. But in California, we have a number of forms of direct democracy. The progressives of the late put in these forms of direct democracy to be able to go around the legislature because they saw that the legislature in California was being controlled by railroads and other wealthy capitalists. And they saw that the legislature was not really doing what most of California popular sovereignty. And so they put in mechanisms whereby we, the people of the state of California, could go around this legislature that didn't seem to be making decisions that would help the people. So that's the idea behind it. Sadly, the reality has been a little bit more complicated. It's been difficult and different than that. And so we want to talk about those. But then recently, there have been some changes that have come through the direct democracy route that have perhaps had some positive changes on the way in which California's political system works. So in terms of talking about some of the more negative aspects is that even though the idea of an initiative, which is the core of the idea of direct democracy, even though the initiative change a law or you can change even the California Constitution, sounds like a powerful way in which you can give power. It is the fact that it's usually wealthy individuals and interest groups that can use these tools more easily. The signatures that need to be collected, the 5% you need to change a law or 8% for a California constitutional amendment, those are ones that they can afford. It can cost upwards of several $100,000 to over $1 million to collect the number of signatures that are necessary to be able to put a ballot measure, whether it is to change a law or to do change the Constitution in California. And those are things that individuals don't have that kind of money, but wealthy individuals and interest groups do have that money, and they can spend it relatively easily, and then they can spend the money that's necessary during the advertising, the time when we, the people, decide whether or not we want to vote in favor of it or not. What also happens is that because it's relatively easy to put on measures onto the ballot, that if there is an interest group or a corporation that is worried about the implications of a particular thing, they can put competing measures onto the same ballot. And usually when there are these competing measures that show up on the same ballot, we'll just reject all of them. Complicated ballot measures that are put on there. There are things that we're asked about that are relatively and saying yes or no to those complicated things in terms of what should be the electricity generation rates or what sort of fines might there be if someone is giving out the sort of bags that are plastic bags or things like that. They are not, well, a yes or no question, which is what an initiative or a referendum is going to look like. And so it creates simplistic solutions to complicated problems. There is also some indication that some of the concerns of the framers of the U.S. Constitution had is that we, the people, might be convinced by easy solutions without considering the consequences. And so we have in the late 1970s Proposition 13, which capped the rate of property tax increases to be no more than 2% per year to give some stability to that. It came out of a time period where the taxes on individual property was going up considerably. Property taxes are typically the way in which schools, local schools, public schools are actually paid for. And so when this was proposed to change it so that we would cap the amount of property taxes that could be collected, the tax rate could only change a small amount from year to year, that would have huge implications for the amount of money that would be available for public schools. And many Democrats and Republicans in California at that time pointed out that this would have a huge impact in terms of how schools would be funded. And yet, the people decided that they wanted it, even though they were warned that this is going to lead to starving the schools of the resources that they might need. And in many ways, the concerns that were put forward have actually been realized. And so California, which 1970s had the education system that was the envy of the world, where California students were near the top in math skills and things like that, and nationalized tests and things like that, relatively quickly changed to moving down to be put with states we like to laugh at in terms of our reading scores and math scores are down with places like Mississippi and Alabama. And so we like to joke about those things, but we're in that same group, and in large part because of the funding. There are other issues that came up in that time period, so it's hard to pinpoint exactly, but some research has been done to show that certainly the starving of money that's given to schools did have an impact in terms of the quality of our system. There was a three strikes law that was put into place in the 1990s that is that if you are convicted of 3 felonies, on your 3rd felony, you're automatically going to be put into prison for 25 years to life. That is a mandatory sentence. It was seen as something to say we're saying no to crime, things like that. And so that was one that was put forward. And that has contributed considerably to the increase in the populations. We spend more money on prisons than we do for higher education here in California. There have been ways in which the federal government has said that the treatment of those who are incarcerated in California aren't meeting the federal standards of care, and so we need to come up with solutions. Judges have said we need to deal with the overcrowding of our California prisons because of the number of people who are in the prisons. And as well as people get older, the costs of dealing with those older inmates, the medical issues that they have, increases the costs of doing those things. And finally, there was also an implementation in the 1990s to have a term limit for legislators, that the number of terms that they can serve in the California Assembly and the California Senate was limited. And so we had that it was a limitation so that you could serve no more than 3 2-year terms in the state assembly and no more than 2 4-year terms in the state senate, as a way to make sure we didn't have career politicians, that we wanted to make sure that new ideas came in. The problem with that is that it takes a while sometimes for members of the legislature to gain the expertise that they need to be able to pass legislation that will be helpful. It often shifts the expertise away from the elected individuals who we can hold accountable and moving instead to bureaucracies who are not elected or interest groups who are not electors, had more expertise than the legislators. And so some argue that that was a problem. But it was passed as a way of dealing with career politicians. And again, you don't have to agree or disagree with this, but it is one in which it's an indication that some have argued that people are persuaded by easier solutions rather than more difficult ones, or not thinking through the complicated implications of those. But there have been some changes that have been using direct democracy to make changes to our political system so that have potentially important changes. So one is the top 2 primary. So in California, we have for all offices except for the primaries for the President of the United States, it works the same way, is that all candidates, regardless of their political party, run in what is called a jungle primary. Everyone runs together, and you get to vote for whomever you want. You get to vote for one candidate, whomever, and the top 2 vote getters then move on to the general election. And so you could have it that there will be 2 Republicans who run against each other in the general election. You could have 2 Democrats. You could have a Democrat and a Republican. You could have 2 people without any political parties, or 2 people, one from the Green Party and one from a Reform Party. So there are different ways in which the top 2 primary hopefully opens up the possibilities of who is actually going to run the general election. We also have the Citizens Redistricting Commission, which is that the boundaries for the state legislature, for the state assembly, the state senate, and also for the U.S. House of Representatives, that those district lines change as the population changes, as we know from the political debates about the census that are going on right now, of whether you should include a citizenship question on the census. But a census is done every 10 years according to the U.S. Constitution. And that will then tell us how many people live in as the population shifts, you want to make sure that each district has basically the same number of people. And so the district boundaries need to change. In most states, and prior to the adoption of the Citizens Redistricting Commission, California was one of those states, is that the state legislature would draw the district lines. And in many ways, they got to choose the voters rather than the voters choosing them. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the idea of gerrymandering later in the course. But now we have in California that is a nonpartisan Citizens Redistricting Commission that does it. Or if it's not nonpartisan, it is set up in such a way as having it so that there are Democrats, Republicans, and independents, people who decline to be Democrats or Republicans, who are on that commission to decide how the boundaries are going to be drawn. And finally, the three strikes law that we talked about has been, in 2012, was changed in part because of people seeing the difficulties that were going on. That too many people were actually being put into prison for life imprisonment because of a felony conviction, but a nonviolent felony conviction. And so people were there, some examples of writing some bad checks, some people who stole socks and worth $140 or something like that, but it was technically a felony, and that would lead to them going to prison for the rest of their life, or 25 years to life. And so we've now changed it so that final three strikes, that final strike needs to be a violent felony. Otherwise, there is some discretion in terms of what sort of sentence you have. So in all of these, again, you can disagree with it of whether it's politically right or wrong, but you can see ways in which it is possible to use the direct democracy to make some changes to the political system, and we take advantage of that because it's easy to do. You couldn't do this at the US level. So the United States, for example, might also think about doing term limits, and we're going to be talking about that later in the course as one solution, because people who run for office generally get reelected when they're running for the House or the Senate to huge levels. And so some have argued maybe we should institute term limits. But the only way to get term limits at the federal level, the national level, is to have a constitutional convention. And so for many, when they hear that, they're like, well, that won't happen. So it makes that change, which might have a positive impact, may not, but it might have a positive impact, can't be done again because of the voting rules.